Hello, everybody. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff at the Kelowna Art Gallery, I'd like to thank you all for joining our virtual Curators Talk this evening. My name is Ryan Trafanenko, and I am the Education Coordinator of Children and Family Programs here at the Kelowna Art Gallery, and I'll be moderating this evening's talk. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Kelowna Art Gallery is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Okanagan Silex people. And tonight, the Kelowna Art Gallery is pleased to introduce Barry Till. Welcome, Barry. Barry is the curator of an exhibition here at the gallery called From Geisha to Diva, the Kimono of Ichimaru, which is currently on display at the gallery until October 11th. Barry Till was the curator of Asian art at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria in Canada for 36 years. 36 years, wow, Barry. It's a long time. He has published more than 150 catalogs, books, and articles on various Asian art topics, and has organized more than 150 Asian art exhibitions. He has given lectures on Asian art in numerous museums and cultural institutions throughout Canada and the United States. So tonight in this talk, Barry is going to discuss the role of geisha in Japanese society and one of the most successful and influential geishas, Ishimaru, as evidenced by her prolific recording career and her beautiful wardrobe, which is showcased in the exhibition. Before I hand it over to Barry, I just wanted to go over a few quick points. If any of you have questions, that's great. Please hang on to them. We're going to be pulling some questions from the chat after Barry is finished lecturing in about 45 minutes. And we'll have about a 15-minute or so question and answer period with Barry. So I will remind you guys about typing that in a few minutes. Please note that today's lecture is being recorded and will be available for a later date. So I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our speaker for the evening, Barry Till. Take it away, Barry.
Thank you, Aaron. This is a new experience for me. I'm looking forward to giving this lecture. So bear with me if I'm a little bit nervous. But I've given this lecture, it must be about 50 times. I've followed the exhibition across Canada and the US. It's been to about 20 plus galleries and museums. And it's been a very popular show, and I've enjoyed putting it together. And I'll give you a bit of background about how we got the kimono. The kimono, when Ichimaro passed away in 1997, she gave her collection to a very close confidant, Fumio Suzuki. And she lived nearby on the Sumida River, and they're very close friends, very good, close confidants and everything. And she did give a few costumes to a Nagoya Museum, which is close to where Ichimaro was born. But the Japanese are not fond of having secondhand clothes. Anyways, there was still a large number of pieces, and she approached a friend in Vancouver, who I very much appreciate, Kiyoshi Kobayakawa. And if it wasn't for her, this exhibition wouldn't have, and collection wouldn't have come to us. And she was immediately said, oh, see if the art gallery wants it. So when I talked to her first, I was so excited to get this. And it came around 1999. And we had the Audain Foundation sponsor the catalog, the first one we did. So it was very enjoyable. So that's how the collection came here. We have one of the best collections of Japanese art in all of Canada. And therefore, we have had this collection come to the perfect spot. And I'm going to start talking about the geisha's role in Japanese society. I'll also talk a little bit about her life and what she went through. It's kind of a sad, happy story. So without any further ado, I'm going to start now. And whenever I think of geisha, I often think of just red and white because of the lipstick and the white makeup that they wore. Now, the geisha, in the West, we've always thought of them as being rather immoral, tawdry, something that was just not very nice. The Japanese, on the other hand, have the highest respect for them. They are an icon of femininity and highly regarded, especially in the past. Things have changed now, but in the past, they were always considered very important, very unique, and everybody loved them. Now, when I first started doing this show, I was asked by a newspaper, just give us one line on what a geisha is. And one line, or one sentence, sorry. So I figured I'm going to give a real long sentence. So here goes. Geisha were high class, well-educated, hostess courtesans who entertained wealthy, sophisticated, and powerful Japanese gentlemen who wished elegance, culture, and brilliant conversation in an exotic atmosphere of decadent refinement. And I think that covers just about everything. And the newspaper was happy with it. I just thought it was maybe too long, but I gave it anyways. Now, why have they become so popular? Because they're highly educated, they're sophisticated. They've been trained in the proper etiquette. They are top dancers, musicians, singers, very, very good conversationalists. Just they know how to stroke the male's ego because they would always make him feel that he was special. They fussed over them like they were kings in Japan. That's why especially older Japanese gentlemen really liked them a lot. Now, in 1956, in Japan, they made prostitution illegal. So the ordinary prostitute was not able to work in the public, did continue. But the geishas were left untouched because they were not considered something like that. They were considered to be very exotic entertainers who provide you with all sorts of important aspects of Japanese culture. So they were showing traditions, the singing, the dancing, everything was from Japan's past. And here's the key. If they found you to be a bit of a lout, they didn't have to have sex with you. In fact, sex was never totally guaranteed. They had that ability and they were hugely expensive. It was a bit of a status symbol to be able to hire one to host your party or to go with her. Now, so as I mentioned, if you were a lout, as you can see in this image at the very bottom, it shows a geisha looking at this drunken person. This person got out of hand, so she's booting him out of the tea room, and she'll send him a bill the next day. So as I said, there's never any guarantee you'd have sex. In some cases, they were just being hired to be hostesses at parties. Now above you can see, around this particular print, you can see groups of men. Sometimes they would be hosting the party and sort of being the entertainment with singing and dancing. They were loved, especially by men of power. The samurai liked them, generals, businessmen, politicians, even members of the royal family. Very cultured people like poets, actors, artists, intellectuals also enjoyed being entertained by them. They were really important because you could discuss openly different things like business deals, plots were hatched, war was planned, and they knew that it would be total secrecy. Secrecy was paramount. They had a code of silence and confidentiality, so you could trust them. That's partly why these men liked to be with them, because they were so special and they could make a man feel fantastic. Now, why in the West do we think of them as tawdry, immoral, and something not so nice? It's because of the Americans. The Americans, this is a movie with John Wayne called The Barbarian and the Geisha, made in 1958. And it's totally untrue. When Townsend was there, he did not have a geisha. In this movie, she plays more or less as a liaison officer, a translator. And she was not a geisha in it. But anyways, it was a popular movie. It does show a little bit of Japan, and it was interesting to see. Now, where does it come from? After the war in 1945, through the Korean War in the early 50s, a lot of American GIs were stationed there, and they fell for some prostitutes. The prostitutes began calling themselves geisha. They were actually regular prostitutes. In fact, the Americans came to refer to them as geisha girls. And they provided services for the men. in this particular image, you can see at the very bottom corner on the right, those are geisha. And actually, some American sent this postcard to a friend saying that they are Japanese prostitutes. Well, not really. The other ones probably were. But that's why we see, I'm trying to differentiate between these and the real geisha. But it's the Americans who really gave that impression. So even in later times, in the 70s and 80s, Americans always had, especially men from World War II, had this thing about geishas, and including some very important people. In 1974, when Gerald Ford went to Japan, taking with him a few others, they went gaga over the geishas as they were sitting having a meal. There's that thing in their back of their mind, how special they were to all the soldiers. You even see the other two gentlemen, I don't know if you recognize them. One's Henry Kissinger, and the other one is Rumsfeld. And look at how they've just feeling goofy and flirting with the geisha. Kind of interesting. So this is where the idea of the geisha came from, the geisha. A more realistic movie that came out, I guess is about, I think it's 2005, if I'm not mistaken. It's called Memoirs of a Geisha. And it was written by Arthur Golden. And what he did is he interviewed a lot of geisha, and including one in particular. And then he wrote the Memoirs of a Geisha. It was quite good. The book was good. The movie was quite good, except for one thing. The producers decided to use Chinese women as the two lead women. And it didn't go down well in Japan. It was a bit of a faux pas, I thought. Anyways, just before they were about to make this movie, I got a phone call from the movie studio, which was linked to Steven Spielberg, asking if they could borrow our costumes for the movie. Fortunately, it was going to be on the road for the next several years, and I could say no. So it was, otherwise, I think the costumes would have come back in bad condition. Okay, should be showing you how the society began and what the beginning of the geisha. During the Edo period, that's from 1603 to 1858, we had 4 classes in Japan. The emperor was at the top, but he was just a figurehead. He didn't have any power. The shogun had the power. He was from the warrior class, and below him were feudal lords and samurai. So the upper class were known as the warrior class or the samurai class. Class number 2 was the peasants. They made up nearly 90% of the population, and they were dirt poor. So why would they be second class? Well, they provided the food and made the country run. So they were considered important from that aspect. If it wasn't for them, they couldn't survive. The third class people were the artisans, people like furniture makers, people who made shoes, umbrellas, generally just anybody who made things. And at the very bottom of the classes were the merchants. And unfortunately for them, they were placed there because they weren't considered to be essential. However, they came to be the richest people in Japanese society with all their trading and everything. And they became the main people who used the geishas. And they were known as the townspeople, and they were quite wealthy, and they had nice homes. Now, the very beginning of geisha. The first people geishas are basically from the Edo period. So in the early part of the 17th century is when they made their first appearance. And geishas are linked to the kabuki theater. Now, the first kabuki actor and her troupe was a woman, not a man, Okuni. And she would perform for parties, and men just fell in love with them. And they caused a lot of yearnings, and prostitution did develop. So eventually the government decided to ban women from performing in kabuki, and that has lasted to this day. And it's much like Shakespearean plays with all the men playing all the parts. Anyways, once the women were banned in 1629, what you use for women? At the very beginning, they used young men to play the female parts. But unfortunately, the crowd still began finding them very attractive. So they had to ban young boys from playing these parts for their own safety. This particular image you see here, the young man, that's what's happening now. So young men are allowed to be back in the theater again. These people became known as onagatas. They were female impersonators. So after the young boys had been banned, usually men around 36 to 40 and even older began playing the part of females. So they had to study careful how women acted. So they really took it very seriously. And when you see a lot of these plays, usually the women, actually the men impersonators, were not very attractive. So even when you see them in prints, usually they're not very attractive because they're men, of course. But they learned how to copy every aspect of the women of Japan. In fact, a lot of Japanese men would say to their wives, "Why don't you act more like those women in the kabuki plays?" In other words, a bit of an insult to the women that the men could actually copy the right behavior. Now, because women disappeared from kabuki, they had to go into the red light districts, and you find them in Japan. And this is what the townspeople or the merchants, they're the ones who could afford it. And there are different classes of people in the Yoshiwara, different classes of prostitutes, some very expensive ones known as courtesans, and they're the ones who would eventually develop into geisha. Geisha. Well, the very first geisha were men. And the reason for that was because at drinking parties, you wanted to be entertained. And the men were jesters, they were acrobats and everything. But soon the crowds began thinking, well, we're drinking, we'd like something else. So geisha began moving in. Geisha actually means, and the two words mean gay, sha, and it means accomplished or arts, and one is sha, so it's a person of the arts or an accomplished person. And they developed into the geisha. So this is around the 17th century or so, into the 18th. And they became the geisha, which were a little bit different than the courtesan itself, but that's where they developed from. And that was developed as a result of kabuki kicking out the women and not having celebrities that you could yearn for. Now, the geisha and the courtesans, they always had fantastic kimono on, as you can see from these Japanese prints. Just beautiful colors, exceptionally expensive, and people fell in love with it. And the men just went crazy because this was so nice for them to see people like this. Let's continue on here. So a geisha had to carry herself in such a way that it looked first class. Even if she didn't have a lot of money, she would always travel first class, either in a rickshaw or on a palanquin or sedan chair, just because she wanted to place herself above the ordinary person so that people could think, oh, there's something special here. It was a bit of snob appeal to be dealing with the geisha. So usually, let me go back for 1 second. They were accompanied by a young girl who was known as a maiko, and that was an apprentice geisha. And they were there to learn all the skills and eventually become a geisha. Usually young girls went in at the age of 6 to 11 to be trained. And by the age of between 17 and 18, they were offered for being deflowered, and men would pay a huge price for it. Once they were deflowered, their collar would change from being red to white. In more modern times, the geisha started changing outfits in the 1910s and 20s, but the Japanese men hated it. There's a bit of anti-foreign feeling towards this, and they wanted things to be strictly Japanese. So while they did experiment with Western clothing, they eventually had to go back to wearing the traditional kimono with the obi, because that's what the Japanese men wanted. So these are views of Gion in Kyoto, where there still are geishas. Now, where did the geishas come from? In ancient Japan, you had large families. Sometimes the poorer families couldn't afford to feed all their children. And in some cases, they would sell their children to either brothels or geisha houses. And at that age, it was quite young, it was very traumatic, but it was referred to as, there's a Japanese word for it, reducing the number of mouths to feed. In other words, we can't feed them, so we will sell them for the good of the family. It was known as a noble act, they felt, that they're sacrificing the girls were told that they're sacrificing themselves for the good of the family. But they went from knowing the rest of the members of the family into a totally new world. It was a world of women, especially if you were in the geisha houses. There you were assigned to do a certain amount of work. There's to be discipline, nothing that they knew about. So they left their families. You could not run away. You had to become interested in what you're doing and accept not to fall in love. And the families themselves felt, you know what, we're providing our daughters with a chance to have salvation, a good education, decent food, decent clothing, and they had a chance to meet very interesting people. So the families tried to justify selling their daughters, that this would help them in their life. But many of them were expected to help their families back home once they got going. But they started out often as maids from about 6 to 11. And they were scrubbing, cleaning clothes. And eventually, if they were smart enough and pretty enough, they would be made a maiko. And that's the apprentice geisha. And you can see her in the background of the right picture holding the umbrella. And you would accompany an older member of the geishahood. And that would become your sister. So there's a certain sisterhood there too. You'd follow her wherever she went. She would be teaching you. She'd be helping you out. But the second you arrived, you were you had to have a tab set up. You were being told that we'll pay for your meals, for your education, any health problems, we'll pay for your medical bills. So they had a tab being set up from the time they arrived. And if they wanted to get free of the geishahood, sometimes they would have to be paying this back. And because of all the clothing and everything else that was being bought for them and the training, it was very expensive. So you were really difficult to leave the geisha house. So once they were in the geisha house, the mother, the Japanese mother, Okasan, would be paying the expenses. And I said, writing down the tabs and getting you trained in all sorts of things. So if you look at this, life does not seem to be too bad. So you have a mother and you have usually an older sister who is helping with training you. So you see here, usually geisha houses would have sometimes as many as 10 or more young girls with their geisha older sisters. And as a geisha, you would learn all sorts of neat party tricks, how to behave. It's always very disciplined, and everybody seems to have been towing the line, and they had to study really hard for everything. They had special teachers for the drums, for the shamisen, sort of like a banjo. And sometimes these women would be practicing all the time from these good teachers. And they said that often they'd even get bloody fingers from practicing so much. They had to learn how to dance, how to move. In fact, one of the sexiest things about the geisha was the way they moved. You'd hear the soft movement of the clothing, the kimono touching the bamboo mats, and just the sound was considered very sexy, the movement. They had to know all about things like the tea ceremony, how to serve tea in a certain way, how to behave in a such certain way. And a lot of their way of speaking was sort of antiquated, but that's what older Japanese men liked. It was very sophisticated and it just seemed like you were so important. You had to learn things like flower arranging, ikebana. Everything was sort of very important to show how you were different than the average Japanese woman. You learned how to paint, how to read, how to write. Some became poets. You were taught how to fold napkins. And again, one of the key things was knowing how to flirt with the man and make him feel that he is so important. Make him maybe even suggest a few ideas and then say, oh, you had a great idea. In other words, making him feel that he was important and he came up with the idea. So the geisha became Japan's unparalleled conservators of traditional costume music, song, and dance. So as Japan was changing in the 20th century, late 19th and 20th century, after they'd opened their doors to foreigners coming in 1853, Japan began westernizing a lot and adopting Western clothing, both men and women, a lot of Western habits, but there was sort of a bit of a backlash, like we have to remain Japanese, and the geisha were always there preserving things. And in the old days, the geisha were considered a valued possession of a city and a measure of its vitality. They're often referred to as living treasures of Japan or living works of art, because you look at them, they're totally beautifully dressed, they are totally educated, they are not a common prostitute, they are a high-class lady who is very, very sought after, mainly as sort of a snob appeal, something that you could show off to your friends. I can afford this. Now, when you were a maiko, you had to have your hair done up and then sleep on these hard pillows, these wooden pillows with a little bit of padding to keep your hair in place. But once you got to be a geisha, after you'd been deflowered, you got to wear a wig most of the time. You didn't have to worry about your hair. So we have a wig in the exhibition. And they would get this done about every few weeks. They'd joke with the wig comber and everything. Now, a lot of these wigs were originally being made of Japanese hair, but they found a lot of good hair could cut, and they'd trade it for it with Chinese hair. For some reason, Chinese hair seemed to be slightly thicker, and also they mixed it with a bit of yak hair. And that came out, and then you'd oil it down, and it would look something like this. Now, this particular wig here, which belonged to Ichimaro. Notice that little orange thing in the middle there. That cost the art gallery of Greater Victoria about $1,000 or so. The reason why we sent the show to Baton Rouge in Louisiana, and when it got to the border for the first time, it had already been in the States several times, the border person said, it's a piece of coral. Of course, I was called up and said, no, it's a piece of plastic. No, it's coral, and you have to take it right back. So it got to the border, I think it was Blaine. We had to bring it all the way back to Victoria and remove that hairpin and then send it down again. So things like that do happen, but it's not it sounds funny, but I was a little bit ticked. Okay, now if you look at the wig, it has got sort of a netted aluminum foil underneath it, and then the hair stick onto that. So you don't really see it because with the white of the makeup sort of covers most of it. A lot of money was spent by the geisha for their makeup. You see red lipstick, black for the eyebrows. And this is obviously a geisha because she wears a wig. Now, in the old days, they wanted to make their skin white, so they used this particular material, but it had a lot of lead in it. So it caused damage to the skin, premature aging, sometimes bad skin disease, and sometimes even death. After a while, they realized it's not the right thing to do, so they switched to another white material, which was made from rice husks, and the red was from safflower flowers, so that was okay. So that being organic, those things worked much better, and they didn't have to put up with the silly leads makeup. Now, when you see people in the West, they have certain sexy parts of a woman's body, which they really like. The Japanese like something else, the nape of the neck. And therefore they put makeup on it. So you have sort of this, looks like 3 fingers coming down or 3 fingers going up, whatever way you want to call it. So geishas will have this particular makeup on them when you see them in the street. Now, the geisha, this is a very interesting image here. We now have a gigantic collection. This is not one from her collection, but a woman in Edmonton has collected a large number of retro Japanese photographs. They're albums, and they're sort of hand tinted sometimes. And we've now got a huge collection. This is not necessarily from her collection, but we've got a lot or some in this lecture that will be from her collection. So the gallery continues to get more and more Japanese things, and they're all fitting together in these nice stories. So this is some geishas, and notice the bathtub. It's being sort of, like a big tub. Now, this sometimes causes a little bit of a problem when it's traveling. I've done some exhibitions on Japanese prints in the past. And I would put in a few of these erotic prints, and it could upset people, but I felt I had to do it if I was doing it, because 10% of all the Japanese prints being made were erotic. And if you don't include them, then you're not really doing a good survey of Japanese printmaking. So we did have a problem or two occasionally. One incident happened in Winnipeg, but it's a long story. Anyways, they could be very tender love or a little bit not so nice. And but these particular books, there's a set of them from Ichimaro in the exhibition. And the reason why we put them in is because most geishas had this. Now, originally, these books were meant to be sex manuals, sort of like Alec Comfort's Joy of Sex. I don't know if you are as old as I am and can remember that from the 1970s, but they were sort of illustrations on various aspects of lovemaking. So geishas would have this, and we do have the set in the up in the exhibition, and it does show a lot of different things. And other uses for this was the samurai, often in Japan, had to leave the capital for 1 year. They stayed in the capital for 1 year, then went back to their home prefecture for another year. But they had to leave their wives and mistresses in the capital of Tokyo. So they were without female companionship in most cases when they went away for a year. These particular books and woodblock prints served a purpose of visual stimulation. And here's something interesting, and fairly recently, I guess it's about a decade or two ago, somebody did research into all these gazetteers, and they found all sorts of shops with a list of who was buying these. Sure, there's a lot of samurai and firemen, but there's also a lot of women were buying them as well. And again, probably to serve as a visual stimulation. But it was thought that a lot of these books were also used by newlyweds who may not have known about sexual ways. So they played a very important part in history. But as I said, some can be very, very dark. In most cases, they're quite nice. I have actually done 2 Japanese erotic print shows without any problems at the art gallery. And part of the reason why was because some of the genitalia was about 3 to 10 times bigger than it should be. And sometimes we put up in the gallery and put up a sign that don't go in if you might be offended. And it was mainly elderly women who went in there, and we could hear them laughing away. So they enjoyed it, and it was not taken seriously because it was much like cartoons because everything was so exaggerated. But anyways, the geisha did have these books, and that it helped to sort of stimulate their clients. Now, if you were a geisha, you had to make a lot of money to pay back your tab, what you owed the geisha house. And if you were, and a lot of geisha were actually very good businessmen. Now, if you were not, you had to find a dana, a sponsor who might be willing to buy your debt from the geisha house and keep you in a manner which you'd like to have. These guys often had what was called iki, sort of a style, a chic style. They were the stylish guys who wanted to be seen with geisha. So that's what they always hoped for. So if you were lucky enough, you could find it. In some cases, you'd find quite older men, businessmen, in some cases, generals. In some cases, you got real handsome guys like the one in the bottom left. So there's always that hope that if you didn't make it in business and you're getting older, that somebody would sponsor you and you would be able to have a good retirement. So when you see in Japan, you will see certain people walking around, and who are obviously the geisha, the ones who are dressed so beautifully. Now, here's an interesting thing. Wives versus geisha. Men in Japan like to be babied. They like their mothers looking after them, their wives, their daughters. They just liked to be looked after, well looked after by the female sex. The wives often knew that their husbands had geisha, but were not too upset. Why would that be? Because geisha was so expensive, it was just sort of, in most cases, it was just a little bit of a fling, a little bit of something that you do once, but you couldn't afford it. They often felt very comfortable. But there was a few other things that made them comfortable as well. The fact that with a lot of Japanese men, they have to entertain their employees. And if you had a geisha, he would have the geisha entertain them outside in the city. He wouldn't bring the people home for the wife to have to look after. Her responsibility was basically looking after the children and more serious things. And whereas the geisha, if you were able to afford it, she would entertain your friends with dances and various things. And Therefore, the wife was happy that I don't have to work, because you know, the Japanese tended to like to drink a lot. She wouldn't have to look after these people getting rowdy at home. And therefore, she was quite pleased. And quite often, Japanese will say, our wives were for procreation, for having children. Geisha were for recreation. They were fun, they were risque, they were freedom. You could say just about anything to them. It was really, you wanted to show off if you were able to, could afford a geisha. The wives, they looked after the household. They were much more conservative, and they didn't need to worry about entertaining and having to look after all these people coming. Now, the person who helped write the catalog on the exhibition was a woman named Michiko Worgentine. And she told me that when her father died, she was there with her mother, and suddenly this beautiful woman, quite a bit younger, showed up. And then the mother sort of nodded at her, and I guess they both knew that was their father's geisha and husband's geisha. And it didn't seem like a bad thing. It was something that was there, acknowledged, but it wasn't to be upset over. So this is a scene from a movie where the older widow meets the young geisha. Now, the single most expensive thing for the geisha were the kimono. Once you became a geisha, you had to buy at least 10, and many of them ended up with 100 or 200 of them as time went on. You had to buy them for certain weather, certain ceremonies, certain colors, blossoms. You had to look good all the time. If they got slightly stained or faded, you had to throw them away. The key was you had to look fantastic. And of course, with the kimono come the obi, the sashes, these long sashes, which are put around the waist. And these can be fantastic. You know, in the summertime, you can have them looking at various colors. Everything looks so spectacular that they really were living works of art. Now, in the exhibition, I'm showing you some, before I get to Ichimaru's life, I'll show you some of the costumes in the exhibition. This is the earliest one. This is one that she actually would have worn around 1930 or so. And it's huge. It looks like you'd have to have a 7-foot tall woman. But actually, what you do is the waist, the center part of it, is you crunch it up, and then you put the obi around it. So they makes them look a little bit like a ball. But you sort of bring it up. So quite often these costumes, right in the middle part, you won't see any decoration. Oops, sorry, wrong way. So these are some of the beautiful kimono that are in the exhibition. And what you're seeing is the back of it. And what we've done is butterflied it out so you can see the design better. If you show it from the front, it doesn't look as spectacular. So what you have to do is just look at all the design, beautifully embroidered. These are all custom made. The only person who has that particular one is the geisha herself. The silk is damask, so there's pattern within the silk weaving. Absolutely gorgeous. This is one that Ichimaro wore when she sang the song Wet Swallow, which was for a movie. This is what got her out of the geishahood because she made so much money. She was from then on making a lot of songs for movies. This is one of my favorites, is the Two Peacocks. One of them is dyed and the other one's embroidered, and it is absolutely spectacular. This one I like a lot because after the war, Ichimaru was the first woman to perform in the US, and that was in 1950 in Hawaii, and she wore this particular kimono. This is another one of my favorites, again, damask with the designs. Look at all the embroidery involved. These things were a fortune. So basically you were buying almost like a car every time you had to buy these. This was so much more expensive than what the average Japanese woman could afford. So if you had 100 of these, you were pretty well off, and you can see how expensive the geisha were. They weren't the common prostitute. These are more of her costumes. Aren't they spectacular? Beautiful. And some of them have little, even if you can see the little square box on the right side, those are the marks of the actual tailors or the people who made them, by some very famous ones. So all these come in these nice envelopes, and there's usually a little bit of history behind it in them. Okay, this one here is actually a full kimono, the one at the bottom right. That's a kimono that's been taken apart and sewn together. So that's about 11, 12 meters long. That's all it is. That's all the patterning. You don't have to work much on this. They're all straight cut lines. That's a kimono that was taken apart to wash it, and then afterwards you sew it back together again. We haven't put those back together again because it costs a fortune to do it now. In the old days, it wouldn't, because somebody would do it very inexpensively. You can actually see certain parts especially on the left side where they've been sewn together. So that's how you wash them. This particular kimono is very famous because she used it on the cover of one of her albums. Excuse me. So kimono, I encourage you to go on the internet and ask for a kimono pattern, and you can find that they're like a T shape. They're very simple to make, and you can make quite beautiful items with it. And if you at all know how to sew, try making one. So the show has been to San Francisco and all across the US. So it's been to about 5 US places, really outstanding places. This is what it looked like in San Francisco. It was quite impressive. That's her Ichimaru shamisen, her banjo, if you will. It's usually quite an interesting sound. It's very good for accompanying the voices of the geishas. Usually the cover is made originally from cat skin or dog skin, and eventually it became some other leather. I'm not sure what it was. But we have, if you have Jimi Hendrix guitar, it's worth a fortune. This is Japan's most famous geisha. We have the only shamisen that survived. It's kind of nice. It also went to the National Geographic Museum in Washington, D.C., and was shown there. So these are some of the most prestigious places in the US where you can have this go to. As I said, it went to Baton Rouge, it went to Dallas. So it is very well traveled. And look at this. This is from a very important place, Kelowna. It looks very nice in Kelowna. Kelowna's got one of the nicest displays in Canada. And this looks very nice. Yeah. Now, get to the books. So we were able to do 2 books on her. The first one was From Geisha to Diva, which the show is based on, and the other one was for Pomegranate. That particular painting there, I'll get to that in a second, is very important on the left side. And the other one is still, you can get it at the Kelowna Art Gallery shop. Excuse me, as they had to reprint this particular catalog several times in the States from Pomegranate. Just drinking a little bit of water here. Okay, now Ichimaro. Ichimaro was born into a family with 11 kids. 10 were female, a very poor peasant family near Nagano. And because the family was broke, they decided to sell her. She was one of the better looking of the children, and she was sold at the age of 14. So she didn't actually go really early to be trained as a maid. And she was sent to a hot spring spa and became a hot spring spa geisha. Not a nice place to go, especially if you're 14 or 15. She never forgave her parents. She would never speak to them again. She did help out a couple of her sisters who dropped by for money later on when she became very wealthy. But becoming a low class geisha was not very nice. While there, she began singing, and people realized she had the greatest voice that they had ever heard. She had Nightingale's voice, they said. So eventually, she was able to either buy her way out or somebody sponsored her to go to Tokyo. So from 1920 to 26, she was in these low class hot spa places, which is not very nice. And then eventually she went to a higher class geisha house in Tokyo and began seriously taking singing lessons, shamisen lessons, dancing lessons. And before long, she was one of the top geishas in all of Japan. And these are some of her early pictures, quite a beauty. And then along in the 1927, along came RCA Victor. And they were looking for, because Japan had been closed for so long, they were looking for some of the best singers in all of Japan. Well, men were okay, but not great. The greatest singers in all of Japan were the geisha. They had been taught it. And she became one of 2 of the greatest singers in Japan. And eventually she was able to make so much money, she left the geishahood. But then for the rest of her life, she would continue to live like a geisha, buying geisha costumes and performing like a geisha, and wrote many of her own songs. She became the most famous geisha in all of Japan. They made calendars with her image on it. Very beautiful. Everybody loved Ichimaro. Very, very famous. And then along came this artist, Kiyoshi Kobayakawa. He fell in love with her. He made this particular print here of her. It won award after award after award. He wanted her so badly, but he didn't have enough money. He couldn't support a geisha in the style that she was used to. So he found a way. He made many paintings of her and a couple of prints. This one we have very nice, and it shows it's quite a bit like her. He also made a painting. The painting, and I don't have a bit of picture, I don't know why, in the bottom left-hand corner, That's in our collection, and the other one's in the Fukuoka Art Museum. So there's only 2 that survived the war. Now, Kiyoshi also made this particular image at the right top. It looks a lot like Betty Boop, and there's even some theories that he may have been the person who inspired Betty Boop, the famous cartoon in the US. Anyways, Kiyoshi made a lot of awards with his paintings of his love, the love of his life. Now, another famous incident in Ichimaru's life is she met Charlie Chaplin. He's in the center here, the shorter man, and may have even helped in saving his life. He arrived in 1932, and he was supposed to go to an opening with this Prime Minister Inukai, and instead he said, "Can I go and see a sumo wrestling, a geisha, and meet a kabuki actor?" So on the late 14th of May and the early part of the May 15th, he met a kabuki actor. He met with the mayor of Tokyo. He met with Ichimaro, and then he headed off to sumo wrestling. Now, someplace in that, sometimes between her meeting Ichimaro here, you can see in the center, and the sumo wrestling, Inukai was assassinated. He was assassinated by 11 naval cadets because they wanted him to declare war. They wanted to be more militaristic. He was a peaceful fellow. Everybody liked him. So they assassinated him. But here's the key. They had hoped to kill Charlie Chaplin as well. Why? Because if they killed him, they could maybe start a war with the US. These were militaristic cadets in their 20s, around 20, 21. And they killed this prime minister who was only out for peace because they wanted war. So the thing is, they thought they could cause a war with the States, but they didn't realize that Charlie Chaplin was British, so they wouldn't have caused a war. So it wasn't until later that they found out that they had made this mistake. Anyways, he survived. Ichimaro may have played a part. Had Charlie Chaplin gone to this particular event that the Prime Minister wanted, instead of the geisha and the sumo, he might have been killed. So in some ways, Ichimaro may have saved his life. Now, during the war, in the late 30s, she would go on around and entertain the troops. So she designed a way for geishas to perform on stage in a big group. After the war, she disappeared for a while because she didn't want the same fate as Tokyo Rose. But again, by about 1948, she began coming back. She starred in a movie with which called Tokyo File 212. If you go to I think it's the 38th minute, you'll see her singing, and she is introduced as the greatest geisha of Japan. This is a Japanese or American film made in Japan, but she's also in a lot of smaller roles. If you look to the right, you'll see that she was in a number of roles in Japanese movies, and she met very important, reasonably important, I should say, B actors, Robert Peyton, and Florence Marley. And also, I think at the bottom right, she met with Rod Cameron, who was a Canadian actor. She made a lot of fantastic records. She also made a hit that was, to this day, is said to be one of the greatest hits ever per capita. It was called Shamisen Boogie Woogie, based on American boogie woogie songs. And she was just so popular, she made songs from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. She had her own radio program. She performed on all sorts of Ed Sullivan type shows. She became more beautiful, I think, as she got into her 40s. Look to the left there. I think she's very beautiful there. So we have pictures of her slowly aging. And then she died at the age of 97, but not before she had written several hundred songs, which are very popular in the old traditional style. She won awards, imperial orders. She won an award from the Imperial Order of the Purple Ribbon in 1955. And that was for somebody who was very accomplished. She couldn't live a living national treasure because of her occupation, but she certainly, because of all her writing, all her entertaining, she was one of the top entertainers of the second half of the 20th century as well. She was the Madonna of her age.
So Barry, I'm just going to interject for a moment.
We got about 3 minutes to go.
That's okay.
Yeah.
We're all wrapped up in hearing about Ishimaru. So if any of you have questions for Barry, please type them into the chat now, and I will try to get to as many as I can within the next few minutes. We will likely go over time a few minutes to answer as many as we can, if that's all right with Barry.
Sure, that's great.
Great.
So I can hear
So,
you. Go ahead.
Patricia, I see your hand up. If you can just type the message into the chat box, that would be great. Perfect. Okay. So first question we have is from Karen. She's wondering how prevalent geishas are in contemporary or modern Japanese society, and do they continue to perform their traditional role?
If I could continue with the lecture for another minute, that will come up.
Of course.
Okay, I'll start now. So geisha, you can see them on the streets all the time. You see these ones here, obviously geishas, but also a lot of foreigners now, Germans, Americans, Australians, Chinese in the center are copying and going around dressed up as geisha. The ones in the center, the Chinese ones, the Japanese don't like too much because they rent these costumes and then they go around and pretend they're Japanese. So a lot of foreigners are taking pictures of them. It's called costume play. They're not happy with that because they're not quite as pleasant as some of the Japanese can be. Also more foreigners, our big noses and all. This is what the geisha was started out as, and they had a long, nice history. So the geisha, what happened to them? They had become frozen in time. Who wants them now? There used to be the old men who wanted them. The young men now want bar girls. They want something exciting. They're frozen in time. They represent something from the past. So they are largely dying out. And here are some of the numbers that you ask about. And in 1900, there's about 27,000 of them. In 1927, 80,000. In 1930s, more than 200,000 girls were sold to brothels and geisha houses. In the 1970s, they were very strong again in 17,000. That's when Japan was doing very well. Nowadays, there's 1,000 to 2,000, but they're not real geishas. Some of them are, but most of them are now entertainers. And what they do is they simply are there for foreigners to entertain. There are some that still will be doing, will be sex workers, but largely not. In fact, most of these are women now, and you can't become a geisha until you're 19. So it has cut out all that early training. And I typed in one time, just, foreigners with geisha, and I typed in sleazy foreigners with geisha. So I came up with this one, which he's not a sleazy, he's a scholar. And then I typed, suddenly I found this one. This is when I was on a private jet tour. And these were entertaining geishas. So and I would meet them for another 5 years because I was with this thing, and we always had to be sort of entertained by the geishas, but they weren't real geishas. They were more or less had been trained in singing and everything, but they were entertaining geishas. And that's what most of them are in Japan now. There's still some geishas that do the real deal, but most of them are now there for tourists. So there's the woman I like so much that did all this, Ichimaro. I'm hoping a movie's going to be made. There's a chance that a woman contacted me named Gretchen Jude. She is planning on writing a book about her, and hopefully she will do that. Now, Ichimaru's old home has now become a gallery. You see right there, beautiful home, and that's where Fumio Suzuki, her close friend, lived nearby. So that is where I'm going to end there. So sorry I took so long. Okay, go ahead.
No, it's great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. No, that was fantastic, Barry. Thank you so much. I do have a few more questions, a few really interesting ones. Susan would like to know, how did the geisha avoid pregnancy?
Gee, that's a difficult question. There were some problems. There were some things that did happen which were similar to what happens in the West. If you don't have proper medical people, they would go to doctors if they could. In some cases it would be some attempt at an abortion, and in other cases they'd actually have the child, and then that child would eventually become a geisha and be trained as a geisha. So in other words, you were setting up a bit of a dynasty. If it was a boy and you kept the boy, you were kicked out of the house. So sort of, in many Asian countries, they want to just have the boy. In this particular case, the geisha just wanted to have a girl, because a girl could mean you could still be there, have someone to love, and teach her all the things about being a geisha. So the tradition did carry on.
Great. If anybody else has any questions, please type them into the chat now. Please make sure that at the bottom where it says to, there's a little menu you can click on. Make sure that it says all panelists and attendees, and then we can see those questions coming in. So while we're waiting on a few more, Jenny emailed me previously to ask me about Ishimaru's friend Fumi Suzuki. Were they childhood friends, and how did Ms. Suzuki come to this side of the Pacific?
They were friends in later life, as far as I can gather. Mrs. Suzuki was actually a very good businesswoman. And I think once it was nice to sort of associate with celebrities. They just became very, very good friends later in life. And it was nice that Ichimaro left her her wardrobe, in which she did, you know, she felt a responsibility to find good homes for it. Part of them, as I mentioned before, were given to a Nagoya gallery. And I think the larger portion were given to us. So we have about 30 or so of her kimonos and other jackets and things, and a lot of her paraphernalia as well. We also have a lot of her songs, handwritten, and photographs. We have some glass negatives, all sorts of great things. In fact, the show could be made a lot larger, but we wanted to make sure it could travel easy enough, because it's nonstop travel. People seem to be interested in this show all the time.
Great. What was the relationship between Fumio Suzuki and Ishimaru? And Peter is also wondering how the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria obtained the kimono and other objects. Two-parter.
Two-parter. Well, I have to give credit where credit's due. Fumi Suzuki didn't know me, didn't know the art gallery, didn't know we had a good Japanese collection. However, a person in Canada, Yoshi Kawasawa, did, Mrs. O'Dane. And she called me up one night and said, "Are you interested?" And I just about froze for a second, because I couldn't get out yes quick enough to say, yes, we want this stuff. Because in the back of my head, I just knew the association with a geisha would be the lucky charm, because nobody else has got geisha costumes in North America. They have a few, but we've got a nice wardrobe. Even though she stopped being a geisha in 1933, after she had made all this money. So she's a geisha for 13 years. She continued to live like one. She fell in love with men, but never, she continued like a geisha. I'm not going to get attached to you. So all her costumes are in the kimono geisha style. And that's how we got them. It's entirely because of one woman in Vancouver. So thank you, Yoshi.
Wow, that's great. Dinah wants to know, thank you for the nice comment. You mentioned that geishas were highly educated. Where were they educated? Was it happening in-house or at schools?
Largely, they're being educated by going to a teacher. So some of it, I guess the teacher would come to the geisha houses. In some cases, she'd go and be trained in maybe their studio or whatever. But it was just about everything you can think of. And it ran up a huge bill. And that's why they were so indebted to the geisha house. And in some cases, it was really difficult. In other cases, if you found a sponsor or a man who would buy your debt, then you could get out of it. But they're mainly educated in the geisha house. And I think some of them were traveling around to, maybe an artist or somebody else who could teach them, like a shamisen teacher, the teacher with the banjo. You would have to go to him because they're that important.
So on the line of debt, Paul is wondering what the current average salary of a geisha might be. And did they used to be rich in 1930s, and could they marry? Okay, so we have a three-parter. So current average salary of a geisha.
It varied from time to time. It was prohibitively expensive. The average person could not afford it. Nowadays, we're talking in terms of geisha who are largely tourist geisha. They do fairly well, but I don't think as well as what I'd call a real geisha who does the works. But still, the geisha now aren't in demand by Japanese men. There's a few foreigners, I think, that get them just for entertainment value, but I don't think they'd be making the salaries they would have in the old days. In other words, they were super rich. They were the superstars, the supermodels of their day. And in the 1930s, it was pretty rough. That was a time when, you know, the Depression was around. So a lot of them ended up, you know, being in brothels instead, unfortunately. So it was a tough time, but if you were able, if you were skilled enough and smart enough and pretty enough, you could get out of going to the brothels and be in a geisha house, and much better life. But again, it's not the greatest life either. You know, you're still attached to the geisha house. Did I answer all the questions? I wasn't sure now. Let's see.
Oh, and could geishas marry?
Oh, could. They could, but they'd have to leave the geishahood. In other words, you could have a sponsor, a dana, who would pay your way out, but she would stop being a geisha, and she'd be only that man's mistress and nothing else.
Great. Heidi says, thank you very much, very fascinating. How did geishas become good conversationalists, and were they aware of current events as maybe a way of making conversation?
I'm glad you asked that question. They were very much on current events. They read the paper, because they had to be talking all the time. And they were with some of the leading people around who were doing this. You know, like some of the high politicians. So they had everything to learn. And they also hung out with kabuki actors, and they could spread the gossip about them. So one of their favorite things was spreading gossip like you would about an actor or an actress in Hollywood. So people like to hire them and hear all the latest news, as well as the gossip that was going on with the celebrities of Japan, because these women had the chance to be with them and see how they acted and learn new things. Even though they were supposed to keep a code of silence, in the 1970s, that was one of their downfalls. They began doing National Enquirer type things and spilling the beans on everybody just for the money. So it's interesting what happened in the 1970s.
Judy would like to know about a little bit more about education, and specifically, did their education include any type of needlework or embroidery, or was production of kimono outsourced to like artisans or that type of thing?
Good question. They were outsourced. That was, I guess, not considered to be important in terms of their education. So more of a craft. However, Ichimaro, we'd have some samples of her sister. She got them educated on how to do embroideries. We actually have, I think, 4 images, beautiful images done by her sisters, which she sponsored to these schools. But I think, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but I think embroidery would be considered beneath the geisha, but certainly they were well aware of it, and Ichimaro in particular, having sponsored her two of her sisters to become great embroiderers. And by the way, those particular embroideries, I don't know if they're still there or not, but they were hanging in Government House here in Victoria for a while anyways. I'm not sure whether they're still there or not.
On that question, I had my own question as you were speaking there. I was wondering about how long it would take to produce a kimono from start to finish, considering all the highly skilled work that one would have to do.
That's a good question. Depending on the amount of embroidery work, you'd have the finest silks, and you saw the patterns. Very simple, so it's easy to make, but then you have to make sure all the different colors fit well together. If it's embroidered, that takes a lot more time to finish things like that, and you'd have to have somebody outsourced to do that, and then you'd have, so there'd be a teamwork working on it. Depending on how much ornamentation on it, the white one that you saw with the damask and all the embroideries, the gold leaf and everything, that probably had to go through the hands of 3 or 4 different experts, some who knew how to work with sort of metal threads, which is sort of a gold foil wrapped around the thread. So who knows? It could be, I would imagine, anywhere from a day to a week or 2, depending on how much decoration was on it.
Great. Thank you to the person who wrote in thanking us for the presentation. And yes, we do hope to see you at the gallery before the exhibition ends October 11th. Martha would like to know, I noticed little logos on the kimonos. What were they?
In some cases at the bottom, if it's a little square, that was usually the designer of the costume. The logos at the top, excuse me, were often family crests. Maybe of the geisha herself, or maybe of the actual tailors.
Great. Last call for questions for Barry. If anybody else has a question, please type it in the chat box and I will be able to see it. You're welcome, Martha. Okay, so with that, I'm going to leave it there. I'd like to take a moment to thank you, Barry Till, for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure having you and hearing from you all about this exhibition. You really illuminated a lot of different things for us tonight. So we hope everybody that attended tonight enjoyed this talk. And if you would like to support more programs like this one, please consider becoming a member of the Kelowna Art Gallery. You can find out more about the gallery and membership by visiting our website, kelownaartgallery.com. And once again, the exhibition From Geisha to Diva, the Kimono of Ichimaru, which Barry Till curated, is on display at the Kelowna Art Gallery until October 11th. So we hope to see you guys there. Great, thank you again for joining us. We'll see you later.
Thanks, Ryan, it was great.
Thank you, Barry. Bye, everyone.